I still remember the sound before I remember the sign. It was that dull, stubborn thump of metal being shoved into the ground outside my living room window. The kind of noise that instantly tells you somebody is touching your property without asking. And when I pulled the blinds open, there it was again. Another bright orange HOA violation notice planted right in the middle of my front lawn like someone had claimed my yard as public bulletin space. By that point, it wasn't even surprising anymore. But somehow it still managed to make my blood boil because nobody had called me, nobody had emailed me, nobody had knocked on my door. They just kept showing up every few weeks to decorate my grass with accusations that every neighbor driving by could read before I even got home from work. My name is Ethan Walker, and until all this happened, I was probably the most boring homeowner in Willow Creek Estates. I paid my dues early every quarter, mowed my lawn every Saturday morning, waved at neighbors, stayed out of neighborhood gossip, and honestly believed if you followed the rules, people would leave you alone. That illusion lasted about 14 months after I bought the house. Looking back now, I don't think this was ever about landscaping or community standards. It was about power. And once someone gets comfortable exercising power over people who never push back, they usually don't know what to do when somebody quietly decides enough is enough. The first notice claimed my grass measured half an inch above the allowed height. Funny thing was, I had mowed it the evening before. The second one said my trash can had been visible from the street 24 hours after collection, except I was out of town and my retired neighbor, Mr. Helston, had actually rolled it back behind my fence before lunch. He even laughed when I showed him the violation. Guess they cited the wrong house, he said. I laughed too, at least the first time. Then came the third notice claiming my driveway had an unauthorized vehicle parked overnight. The vehicle in question belonged to my younger sister, who had stopped by for dinner and left before 10. According to the notice, it had supposedly been there until sunrise. I started realizing these weren't mistakes anymore. Somebody wanted a record with my name on it. Still, I kept my cool because that's how I was raised. My dad always said, never assume bad intentions until you've eliminated simple incompetence. So I scheduled a meeting with the HOA compliance coordinator, a woman named Lorraine Bennett. She greeted me with the kind of smile customer service people practice in mirrors. Warm enough to seem polite, but distant enough to remind you she wasn't there to help. She folded her hands across a polished conference table and said, Mr. Walker, we simply respond to homeowner complaints. The board is committed to preserving property values. I slid the 3 notices across the table. Can you show me the evidence? I asked. She tilted her head slightly. Evidence isn't always available to homeowners. I blinked. You're finding people without evidence? Her smile never moved. We're maintaining community standards. That phrase stuck with me because she repeated it 3 different times during a 15-minute conversation without ever answering a direct question. When I walked back to my truck, something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the notices anymore. It was how rehearsed everything felt. Like they expected homeowners to apologize first and ask questions never. A couple weeks later, I repainted my front door. I didn't choose the color myself. I literally ordered the exact paint code listed inside the HOA's approved exterior color packet. Same manufacturer, same finish, same number. I even kept the receipt taped inside my garage cabinet because I'm the kind of person who saves instruction manuals for appliances I don't even own anymore. 3 days later, I came home from work and saw another orange sign planted dead center in my lawn. Unauthorized exterior modification. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievably ridiculous that my brain couldn't process anything else. My next-door neighbor, Carla, was watering her flowers when she looked over and asked, "Again?" I pulled the sign out of the ground. "Apparently my front door violates the color they approved." She frowned. "That's impossible." "I know." She looked around before lowering her voice. "You know, you're not the only one they've been doing this to lately. Most people just pay the fines because fighting City Hall is exhausting." I looked back at the orange sign in my hand. "This isn't City Hall." She nodded slowly. "No, it's worse. They live 3 streets away." That sentence followed me all evening. I made dinner but barely tasted it. I sat in my kitchen staring through the window at the tiny holes left behind in my lawn where they'd shoved that metal stake into the ground. It wasn't about $35 fines anymore. It wasn't even about the signs. It was the assumption behind every single one of them that I'd quietly remove it, mail a check, and move on. Instead, I walked into my office, grabbed my camera, and laid every violation notice across my desk. I photographed each one with timestamps. Then I photographed the holes in my yard. Then the front door. Then the approved paint guide. Then every angle of my property. After midnight, I downloaded the HOA governing documents, opened a spreadsheet, and started comparing every citation against every written rule line by line. By 2 in the morning, I'd found something interesting. By 3 in the morning, I'd found something disturbing. By sunrise, I realized none of the 4 violations actually matched the HOA's own governing documents. Not one. That was the exact moment I stopped thinking like a homeowner trying to clear up a misunderstanding and started thinking like someone documenting a pattern. I didn't know where it would lead yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they loved creating records about me, I was about to start creating records about them. The next morning, I filed a public records request instead of another complaint. That probably sounds boring if you've never dealt with an HOA, but in my state, homeowners had every right to inspect board meeting minutes, voting records, financial reports, and compliance documentation. Lorraine seemed genuinely surprised when I walked into the management office carrying the completed paperwork instead of another appeal form. She glanced down at the request, then back at me with the same practiced smile she always wore. Except this time I caught something underneath it. Hesitation. "That's quite a lot of material," she said. "Take your time," I answered. "I'll wait." She tapped her fingernails on the counter before saying the documents would be available within the legal response period. I thanked her, wished her a nice day, and left without another word. The funny thing about staying calm is that it makes people nervous. Angry homeowners were familiar territory for them. Calm homeowners carrying organized paperwork were apparently something else entirely. During the next week, the violation notices stopped. At first, I thought maybe someone had finally realized they had the wrong address. But then I started noticing little things. A black SUV parked across the street for almost an hour one afternoon. Lorraine drove slowly past my house twice while I was trimming the hedges. One evening, I caught a board member named Russell Dean standing on the sidewalk pretending to look at his phone while staring at my front porch. They weren't trying to collect evidence anymore. They were trying to figure out what I was doing. Then the records arrived. 2 thick boxes landed on my porch late Friday afternoon, and I spent the entire weekend surrounded by binders, sticky notes, coffee mugs, and legal pads spread across my dining room table. At first, it looked like a mountain of meaningless paperwork: meeting agendas, attendance sheets, financial summaries, architectural requests, hundreds of pages that would have sent most people straight to sleep. But patterns have a funny way of revealing themselves when you're patient enough to look. Saturday morning, I found the first one. 3 separate board votes had supposedly passed unanimously, even though attendance records showed they didn't have enough members present to legally hold the vote. I checked the bylaws twice because I assumed I was misunderstanding something. I wasn't. By lunch, I found another. Multiple homeowners had been fined before receiving the written warning required under the association's own enforcement policy. Sunday afternoon, I found something that actually made me stop reading for a few minutes. Russell Dean, the same board member I'd seen watching my house, had approved a landscaping variance for his own property. There was no disclosure, no abstention from voting, no conflict statement, just his signature approving improvements that every other homeowner would have needed permission to make. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. "Well," I whispered to an empty house, "that's interesting." Except interesting wasn't really the right word. It was documented hypocrisy. Monday morning, I drove over to Carla's house carrying a folder. She poured us coffee while I showed her copies of the meeting minutes. She adjusted her reading glasses, scanned the pages, and slowly shook her head. "They actually signed this?" she asked. "Every page. Do people know?" "Not yet." She looked toward my house through the kitchen window. "You thinking about suing?" I surprised myself by answering immediately. "No, why not?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Because lawsuits happen behind closed doors. This doesn't belong behind closed doors." That idea stayed with me the entire drive home. I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. Revenge would have been satisfying for about 5 minutes. What I wanted was accountability. And accountability only works when people can actually see what's happening. Later that afternoon, I drove past a real estate office with one of those rotating display boards sitting near the entrance. 4 large panels slowly turning in the breeze, so passing drivers could read every listing without stopping. I almost drove past it. Then I hit the brakes so hard the truck behind me honked. By sunset, I bought a similar display from a commercial sign supplier 30 miles away. The salesman asked if I was advertising a property. "Something like that," I answered. Building it became almost therapeutic. I sanded the wooden post myself, painted everything a clean matte white, mounted the rotating frame carefully so it turned smoothly even in a light breeze. Then I spent nearly 2 full days designing the panels. No insults, no accusations without proof, no sarcastic comments, just facts. Panel 1 listed the date of an invalid board vote beside the bylaw section requiring a quorum. Panel 2 explained the improper fine procedure with citations directly from the association handbook. Panel 3 showed Russell Dean's landscaping approval alongside the conflict of interest policy every board member had signed. Panel 4 listed every violation notice I'd received, each followed by photographs proving the alleged violations never existed. Everything was sourced. Every claim referenced a page number. Every document came directly from HOA records. Looking at the finished display almost made me laugh because it looked less like a protest and more like an educational exhibit. Tuesday evening, I installed it exactly 1 foot inside my property line, facing the street. I checked local ordinances first. I checked county regulations. I even measured the setback twice. If anyone challenged it, I wanted to know I was standing on solid ground. The next morning, I poured myself coffee and sat on my front porch before sunrise. At first, nothing happened. Around 7:30, the first commuter slowed down just enough to read one panel before continuing. 10 minutes later, another car slowed. By 8 o'clock, someone actually pulled over. Around lunchtime, 3 neighbors stood together in front of the display reading every panel from beginning to end. Nobody touched it. Nobody vandalized it. They just read. By Wednesday evening, people were taking pictures. Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with a call from Lorraine. "Ethan," she began, sounding noticeably less confident than usual. "The board would like to discuss your display." "Sure," I replied. "Which part would you like to discuss?" Silence. Finally, she said, "It's creating unnecessary tension in the neighborhood." "Are any of the documents inaccurate?" Another pause. "That's not the point." "Actually," I said quietly, "I think that's exactly the point." She asked whether I'd consider removing it voluntarily. The same day, the board publicly withdraws every false violation and explains these meeting records to the homeowners. She ended the call without saying goodbye. That evening, Willow Creek Estates looked different. Neighbors who normally hurried inside after work were standing in driveways talking. People I'd never met waved me over with questions. An elderly couple from the next block admitted they'd paid over $1,000 in fines because they assumed fighting the HOA was hopeless. A young family said they'd received violation letters for a swing set that had been approved months earlier. Story after story came pouring out, and for the first time I realized my orange signs had never really been about me. I was just the latest name on a much longer list. Friday night's board meeting was standing room only. Homeowners lined the walls. Some carried copies of documents they'd photographed from my display. Lorraine looked exhausted. Russell Dean avoided eye contact entirely. Board President Melissa Grant cleared her throat and announced they would begin with routine business. A man in the back interrupted before she finished the sentence. "I'd rather discuss why you've been approving votes without a quorum." Another voice followed. "I'd like to know why homeowners were fined without written notice." Then someone else asked about conflict of interest disclosures. It wasn't chaos. It was something far more dangerous for people who relied on silence. It was organized, documented accountability. And for the first time since I'd moved into Willow Creek Estates, the people sitting behind that long boardroom table were the ones struggling to answer the questions. For a moment, nobody said anything. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the air conditioner cycling on above us. And then Melissa slowly removed her reading glasses, looked around at nearly every homeowner in attendance, and realized the meeting she thought she controlled had slipped completely out of her hands. Russell shifted in his chair, cleared his throat twice, and started flipping through papers that suddenly seemed useless. Lorraine avoided looking at anyone at all. The confidence they'd carried for months had disappeared in less than 20 minutes, replaced by the uncomfortable silence that only comes when people know the facts aren't on their side anymore. One by one, homeowners stood up, not to yell, not to insult anyone, but simply to ask questions backed by documents. "Can you explain this vote? Why wasn't this warning letter ever sent? How did this approval happen without disclosure?" Every question pointed back to records the board itself had created. I never said another word after my first question. I didn't have to. The evidence was speaking for me now. About 45 minutes into the meeting, Melissa asked for a short recess. The board disappeared into a side conference room while everyone else stayed where they were, talking quietly among themselves. Carla leaned over and whispered, "I've lived here 18 years. I've never seen them walk out of a meeting. I smiled. Neither have they. 15 minutes later, the board returned looking like they'd aged a decade. Melissa unfolded a prepared statement with slightly shaking hands. She announced that, after reviewing recent concerns, the association would immediately withdraw all 4 violation notices issued against my property, refund every related administrative fee, and begin an independent review of enforcement procedures dating back 2 years. Before she even finished reading, Russell quietly stood up, placed his nameplate on the table, and said, "Effective immediately, I resign from the board." You could have heard a pin drop. Then another board member, Denise Holloway, followed him. "I believe it's also time for me to step aside." They both walked out through the side door without looking back. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. It honestly wasn't that kind of moment. It felt heavier than victory. It felt like watching people finally realize that authority only works as long as everyone believes it's beyond questioning. As neighbors slowly filed out of the clubhouse, dozens stopped to shake my hand. Some thanked me. Others apologized for staying quiet when they saw the orange signs in my yard. An older gentleman admitted he'd assumed I really had been violating the rules. I laughed and told him I probably would have believed the signs too if I hadn't lived through it myself. Saturday evening, just before sunset, I walked out to my front yard carrying a screwdriver and a small toolbox. The display board had become the most talked about thing in Willow Creek Estates, but it had already done exactly what I'd built it to do. I removed each laminated panel, stacked them neatly in a storage bin, lifted the rotating frame off the post, and loaded everything into my garage. Carla wandered over while I was filling the last hole with fresh soil. "That's it?" she asked. "You're taking it down?" "Yeah." She looked surprised. "I thought you'd leave it up for a while." I brushed the dirt off my hands and looked across the street where kids were riding bicycles without their parents stopping to stare at another HOA sign planted in someone's lawn. "The goal was never to embarrass anybody," I said. "The goal was to make sure nobody could pretend they didn't know." She nodded slowly before smiling. "You know, this neighborhood feels different already." She was right. Over the next few months, a new board was elected. Meeting attendance tripled because homeowners actually showed up. Financial reports were posted online. Enforcement policies became transparent. More importantly, the orange violation signs stopped appearing without warning. People still disagreed sometimes because that's what happens when hundreds of families share a community. But disagreements started happening in meeting rooms instead of anonymously in front yards. Looking back now, I don't think the biggest lesson was about HOAs at all. It was about documentation, about patience, about resisting the temptation to fight noise with louder noise. I could have screamed at board members, threatened lawsuits on day one, or turned every meeting into a shouting match. And maybe that would have made me feel better for an afternoon. Instead, I chose to collect facts, organize them carefully, and let the truth stand where everyone could see it. Funny enough, the display board wasn't really a weapon. It was a mirror. And sometimes the hardest thing for people in power is seeing their own reflection. Even now, I still keep one of those orange violation signs in a box on a shelf inside my garage. Friends ask why I haven't thrown it away. I tell them it's a reminder that the smallest act of disrespect can sometimes become the beginning of the biggest change, as long as you respond with your head instead of your temper. But here's the part I still think about from time to time. What would have happened if I just paid those first 4 fines like everyone expected me to? How many more homeowners would have kept receiving notices they didn't deserve? How many people would have assumed the board was always right simply because nobody had ever challenged them? Maybe someone else eventually would have uncovered the truth. Or maybe they wouldn't have. I'd love to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have taken the display down after the board admitted they were wrong? Or would you have left it standing a little longer to make sure nobody forgot? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark different opinions. And honestly, that's exactly how healthy communities are supposed to work. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes standing up for yourself doesn't always require shouting the loudest. Sometimes the strongest response is simply showing the receipts.